Take a moment to picture yourself waking up at your dream lake cabin, only to see a steel fence surrounding the entire home, locked. From the outside, I didn't build it, I didn't approve it, and I sure as hell didn't give anyone permission. Would you stay calm? Or tear it down right then and there? Let me know in the comments, because what I did, well, it escalated fast. See, this wasn't just some neighborly dispute, it was the HOA, an unelected army of clipboard tyrants, and their president, she made one mistake. She fenced in the wrong man. You won't believe how I made the only dock on the lake disappear overnight. And no, it wasn't vandalism, it was justice. And it started right here, with a lock that clicked from the wrong side. The morning started like any other Tuesday in early September. I'd been living in this cabin for 15 years, ever since Grandpa Bennett passed and left me his slice of paradise on Mirror Lake. Just weathered cedar siding and a small dock, but it was mine. That morning, though, thick shadows blocked my bedroom window, where morning light should have been. I stumbled out of bed and pulled back the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. A 6-foot chain-link fence topped with barbed wire had been erected around my entire property overnight. Not just the cabin, but everything. My garden, my tool shed, even my access to the lake. It was like waking up in a prison. I threw on jeans and a flannel shirt and stormed outside, my bare feet hitting the cold deck. Standing beyond the fence was a woman I'd never seen before, wearing wrinkled khakis and a white button-down that looked slept in. Her dark hair escaped from what was supposed to be a professional bun. She clutched a clipboard against her chest with the kind of smile that made my skin crawl, the smile of someone who thought they'd just won the lottery. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," she said, sickeningly sweet. "I'm Stella Hayes, the newly elected president of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. I trust you received our notice about the fence installation." Notice? What notice? I hadn't received anything from any HOA. Hell, I didn't even know there was an HOA in this neighborhood. My grandfather bought this property in the 1970s, long before any fancy rules existed. "What the hell is this?" I asked, gesturing at the fence. "You can't just put up a fence around my property without permission." Stella's smile widened as she flipped through papers on her clipboard. "Actually, Mr. Bennett, according to Section 12.3 of the Lakeside Meadows HOA bylaws, any property violating our aesthetic and safety standards can be temporarily restricted until violations are corrected. We're helping you protect the community, but you need to cooperate or there will be worse consequences." She handed me a paper through the fence. "You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance or will be forced to take further action." I snatched the paper and quickly scanned it. Legal jargon about property maintenance standards and community aesthetics. According to this document, my cabin was guilty of having unpainted exterior surfaces, unapproved landscaping, and structures that do not conform to neighborhood standards. Complete garbage, and we both knew it. My cabin might not have been the fanciest house on the lake, but it was well maintained and perfectly legal. "This is ridiculous," I said, crumpling the paper. "My grandfather built this cabin 40 years ago. It was here long before your HOA existed." Stella's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. "That may be true, Mr. Bennett, but your grandfather isn't here anymore, is he? According to our records, you never properly registered your property with the HOA when you inherited it. That makes you subject to all current regulations. Retroactively?" That's when I realized this wasn't about property standards. This was personal. But why? I'd never seen this woman before. I'd been living peacefully on Mirror Lake for 15 years, minding my own business, bothering no one. So why was she targeting me? I looked at her again and noticed her rumpled clothes contrasted with expensive shoes and a leather-bound clipboard. This wasn't some random power-hungry neighbor. This was someone with resources, someone with a plan. "All right, Miss Hayes," I said, forcing calm. "I'll look into this HOA situation and see what I can do about these supposed violations. But this fence comes down today. You have no right to imprison me on my own property." Stella's smile faltered for just a moment, her grip tightening on the clipboard. "I'm afraid the fence stays up until all violations are addressed, Mr. Bennett. But don't worry, I'm sure we can work something out. After all, we're all neighbors here, and I always get what I want in the end." As she walked away, heels clicking on asphalt, I knew I was in for the fight of my life. But what Stella Hayes didn't know was that I wasn't just some random lake hermit. I was a retired hydraulic engineer who'd spent 20 years designing water management systems for the Army Corps of Engineers. I understood construction, water rights, and most importantly, how to fight back against people who thought they could push me around. The war had begun, and I was ready for battle. The first thing I did after Stella left was call Victor Gray. Victor had been living 2 houses down for 10 years, and if anyone knew what was going on, it would be him. Victor was a contractor, the kind of guy who could fix anything with duct tape and determination. More importantly, he wasn't impressed by fancy titles or legal documents. "Marcus!" Victor's voice boomed through the phone. "I was wondering when you'd call. Saw them putting up that fence last night. Stella Hayes and her crew worked until almost midnight." I could hear concern in his voice, but something else too. Fear, maybe? "Victor, what's going on? I've never heard of any HOA in this neighborhood. When did this start?" "About 6 months ago, right after Stella moved into the old Morrison place. Started going door to door, talking about property values and community standards. Said she was a lawyer and knew how to make things better for everyone. Before we knew it, she'd convinced enough people to form an HOA and got herself elected president." Victor's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Marcus, I think she's been planning this. She's got files on everyone, knows exactly who owns what and property values." That sent a chill down my spine. Why would someone move to a quiet lake community and immediately start gathering information on neighbors? "Victor, I need you to tell me everything you know about this woman. Where did she come from? What's her background? Why is she targeting my property?" Victor's voice dropped lower. "You're not going to believe this. Stella wasn't just some ex-lawyer with a grudge. She was already working with developers before she even moved in. I found an old planning document filed under a dummy company. Her name was on it. This was a setup from day one, Marcus. We were the target. About 8 months ago, she got fired. Word is she screwed up a major case and cost her firm millions. Since then, she's been living off savings and looking for a way to get back on top." He paused. "Marcus, I think she's planning to sell this whole neighborhood to developers. There's been talk about building a resort on the lake, and your property would be perfect for the main lodge." Everything started to make sense. Stell wasn't just some power-hungry neighbor. She was a disgraced lawyer looking to make a comeback by selling out our community. My cabin, with its prime lakefront location, was the key to her plan. That's why she'd targeted me first. Over the next few days, I started receiving official-looking notices from the HOA almost daily. First, a fine for failure to maintain approved landscaping standards. Apparently, my wildflower garden was an eyesore. Then came a notice about my dock being structurally unsound and a safety hazard. Each notice came with increasingly hefty fines, starting at $50 and quickly escalating to $500 per day. The final straw came when I lost power and water. According to the utility company, they'd received a work order from the Lakeside Meadows HOA requesting temporary disconnection for safety maintenance. When I called to complain, they told me I'd need written authorization from the HOA president to reconnect. I was essentially being forced to live like a pioneer in the 21st century, all because Stella Hayes wanted to pressure me into selling. That's when I decided to fight back. I'd spent my career dealing with bureaucrats and politicians who thought they could push around anyone without the right connections, but they'd never dealt with someone like me, someone who understood how the system worked and wasn't afraid to use that knowledge. I started by researching property records at the county courthouse. What I found changed everything. When my grandfather bought this property in 1972, he didn't just buy the land and cabin. He bought mineral rights, water rights, and most importantly, underwater land rights, extending 50 feet into the lake. That meant I owned not just my dock, but the entire section of lake bottom where the neighborhood's community dock was located. The community dock was the pride and joy of Lakeside Meadows. It was where residents kept boats, where kids learned to swim, where everyone gathered for 4th of July barbecues. According to the HOA's promotional materials, it was one of the main selling points for living here. But, according to official property records, that dock was sitting on land that belonged to me. I couldn't help but smile, reviewing the documents. Stella Hayes might have been a lawyer, but she'd made a critical error. She'd assumed the community dock was on public land, or HOA-owned property. She'd never bothered to check the original property deeds from the 70s. And that oversight was about to become her biggest nightmare. I called Victor that evening. "I need your help with something, and I need you to keep this between us. Can you meet me tonight after dark?" Victor agreed, though I could hear nervousness in his voice. He had a wife and 2 kids to think about. But Victor was a good man, and he knew what Stella was doing was wrong. As Victor left that night, he turned back with a serious expression. "Be careful, Marcus. Stella Hayes isn't going to give up easily. When she realizes what you found, she's going to come at you with everything she's got." He was right. But what Stella didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this kind of fight my entire adult life. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Kyle Fisher, who lived in the big colonial at the end of Lakeview Drive, was standing outside my fence looking uncomfortable. Kyle was one of those guys who'd moved to the lake for investment potential. He'd bought his house 3 years ago and immediately started talking about property values and market trends. I'd always figured him for one of Stella's supporters, so seeing him at my fence was surprising. "Marcus, can we talk?" I walked over with my coffee mug and waited. Kyle looked around nervously, as if worried someone might be watching. "Listen, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but I think you should know what's really going on with this HOA situation." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. "Stella Hayes offered me $5,000 to vote in favor of her development proposal. She said it was a consulting fee for my expertise in real estate." I took the paper and unfolded it. A signed agreement between Kyle and something called Lakeside Development Partners, promising payment in exchange for supporting conversion of residential properties to commercial use. At the bottom, in small print, was a caught my attention. Property acquisition to commence with the purchase of the Bennett waterfront parcel, followed by systematic acquisition of adjacent properties. There it was in black and white. Stella wasn't just planning to develop the neighborhood, she was planning to buy out every property owner, starting with mine. She was using HOA funds and backroom deals to make it happen. But Kyle's revelation also told me something else. Not everyone was happy with Stella's plans. "Why are you telling me this?" Kyle shifted uncomfortably. "Because I've got kids, Marcus. When I really started thinking about what this development would mean, I realized I didn't want my children growing up next to some corporate resort. This place is supposed to be about families and community, not profit margins." Over the next few days, I started reaching out to other neighbors, carefully testing the waters to see who might be willing to stand up to Stella. What I found was encouraging. Mia Liu, who lived in the Blue Craftsman house near the boat launch, had also been approached by Stella about selling, but unlike Kyle, Mia had received outright, and now she was receiving the same harassment I was dealing with. Constant HOA violations, excessive fines, and mysterious utility problems. "He's trying to force us out," Mia told me during a whispered conversation by the mailboxes. "She can't just seize our properties, so she's making our lives miserable until we give up and sell. It's systematic harassment, and it's probably illegal." Mia was a retired school administrator who didn't back down from bullies. She'd been dealing with difficult people her entire career. But the most important conversation I had was with Deputy Harris from the county sheriff's office. Tom Harris and I had known each other since high school, and he'd been keeping an eye on the situation since HOA complaints started rolling in. "Marcus," he said during our coffee meeting at the diner, "I can't officially get involved in civil disputes, but I can tell you that Stella Hayes has been making some interesting inquiries at the courthouse." Tom leaned forward and lowered his voice. "She's been asking about property seizure laws, eminent domain procedures, and something called adverse possession. She's also been meeting with representatives from Pinnacle Resort Development, the same company that's been buying up lake properties all over the state." He looked around the diner. "Marcus, I think she's planning to use the HOA as a front to seize properties that won't sell voluntarily." That's when I realized the true scope of Stella's plan. She wasn't just trying to buy out the neighborhood, she was planning to steal it. Using her position as HOA president, she could impose fines and violations that would eventually result in liens against properties. If those liens went unpaid, the HOA could foreclose and take ownership. It was sophisticated, but it could work if no one stood up to challenge it. I spent the next few days reviewing every document I could find about HOA laws, property rights, and real estate development. What I discovered was both frightening and encouraging. Stella's plan was legally possible, but it required certain conditions. Most importantly, it required that property owners actually be in violation of legitimate HOA rules, and that those violations be significant enough to justify extreme fines. But here's where Stella had made her biggest mistake. In her eagerness to target my property, she'd overplayed her hand. The fines she was imposing were excessive, the violations questionable, and most importantly, she'd never properly established legal authority for the HOA to impose those fines. The Lakeside Meadows HOA had been formed hastily, without proper documentation and without required approval from all property owners. More importantly, I'd discovered something that would change the entire game. When I dug deeper into property records, I found that my grandfather hadn't just bought underwater rights to the lake bottom under my dock, he'd bought rights to the entire section where the community dock was located. That dock, which served as the centerpiece of the neighborhood, was sitting on land that legally belonged to me. I called Victor that evening. "Victor, I need your help with a project, but it's going to be risky, and if we do this, there's no going back." Victor looked at the property documents and then at me. "What do you need me to do?" I pulled out a hand-drawn diagram showing the lake, the dock, and underwater topography. "I'm going to need some hydraulic equipment, underwater cable, and a lot of courage. because we're going to give Stella Hayes and her development partners a demonstration they'll never forget. Victor studied the diagram, then looked up with a grin. You know what, Marcus? I've been wanting to stand up to these bullies for months. Count me in. I opened the curtain and froze. A uniformed deputy stood like a statue at my gate, papers in hand. For one awful second, I thought they'd come to arrest me. My plan wasn't even in motion yet, and already the counterattack had begun. For a moment, I thought Tom Harris had decided to arrest me before I could execute my plan, but then I recognized the deputy as someone I'd never seen before. He was holding an official-looking document and didn't look happy about being there. Marcus Bennett? When I nodded, he handed me the document through the fence. You're being served with a civil lawsuit. The Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association is seeking damages for property violations, unpaid fines, and obstruction of community development. I took the papers and quickly scanned them. Stella Hayes was suing me for $15,000 in fines and damages, plus legal fees. She was also seeking a court order to force me to bring my property into compliance with HOA standards or face foreclosure. But that wasn't the worst part. The lawsuit included a restraining order preventing me from interfering with HOA business or intimidating HOA officers. Apparently, my conversations with Kyle Fisher and Mia Liu had been reported back to Stella, and she'd decided I was organizing some kind of rebellion. The restraining order meant I couldn't contact other property owners about HOA matters, effectively isolating me from potential allies. I called a lawyer that afternoon, but the consultation didn't go well. According to the attorney, HOA disputes were notoriously difficult to win, especially when the HOA had proper documentation and legal representation. The problem is that homeowners associations have broad authority to enforce their rules, and courts generally defer to their judgment unless there's clear evidence of abuse or fraud. He quoted me a retainer fee of $10,000, with no guarantee of success. I couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle, and even if I could, it would take months or years to resolve. Meanwhile, Stella was moving forward with her development plans, and every day I delayed was another day she had to pressure other property owners into selling. I needed a different strategy, something that would force her hand and expose her real agenda. That's when I decided to take my fight directly to the community. Despite the restraining order, I couldn't be prevented from attending the monthly HOA meeting, scheduled for the following Thursday evening. I spent the next few days preparing my presentation, gathering evidence, and documenting every instance of harassment and intimidation I'd experienced since Stella's fence went up. But Stella wasn't idle either. She hired private investigators to dig up dirt on me and my property, filed additional lawsuits, and even hired security guards to patrol the neighborhood. She also started a campaign of intimidation against anyone who might support me. Victor told me that men in suits had visited his construction site, asking questions about his business licenses and permits. Mia Liu received anonymous phone calls threatening her if she continued to cause trouble for the HOA. Meeting was held in the community center near the lake, and when I arrived, I was surprised to see how many people had shown up. Usually these meetings attracted maybe a dozen residents, but tonight there were at least 40 people in attendance. Word had gotten out about the lawsuit, and people were curious about what was really going on. Stella Hayes was sitting at the front of the room, looking more composed than I'd seen her before. She was wearing a black business suit and had her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Next to her was a man in an expensive suit who I assumed was her lawyer. They both looked confident, expecting an easy victory. "Good evening, everyone," Stella began. "Before we start tonight's meeting, I want to address the situation with Mr. Bennett's property. As you all know, we've been working to bring all properties in our community up to proper standards. Unfortunately, Mr. Bennett has been resistant to these efforts and has even attempted to interfere with HOA business. Tonight, Mr. Bennett will have an opportunity to explain his position, but I want everyone to remember that we're here to protect property values and community standards for all residents." When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and looked around the room at my neighbors. These were good people who deserved to know what Stella Hayes was really planning for their community. "Friends and neighbors," I began 6 months ago, none of us had ever heard of Stella Hayes. We didn't have an HOA, we didn't have property violations, and we didn't have fences going up around our homes in the middle of the night. But what we also didn't have was someone systematically trying to force us out of our homes so she could sell our entire neighborhood to resort developers. I pulled out Kyle Fisher's contract with Lakeside Development Partners and held it up for everyone to see. This is a contract offering payment to residents who support the conversion of our neighborhood from residential to commercial use. How many of you have been approached with similar offers? Several hands went up around the room, and the whispers grew louder. Stella stood up abruptly. "This is completely inappropriate. Mr. Bennett is under a restraining order and has no right to make these accusations." But her voice was shaking now, and I could see panic in her eyes. The tide was turning, but I knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow, everything would change. The following week was a blur of activity. Stella Hayes went into full damage control mode, hiring a team of lawyers and private investigators to dig up dirt on me, my property, and my family history. She filed additional lawsuits, obtained more restraining orders, and even hired security guards to patrol the neighborhood. My property began to feel less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. But I wasn't idle either. Working with Victor Gray, I'd been quietly assembling the equipment and expertise I'd need for my plan. Victor's construction company had access to hydraulic equipment, underwater cables, and most importantly, the kind of industrial pumps used for underwater construction projects. More importantly, Victor had convinced his brother-in-law, who worked for the county utilities department, to provide us with detailed maps of the lake bottom and its underground infrastructure. The plan was audacious, risky, and probably illegal, but it was also the only way I could think of to expose Stella's real agenda and protect my community from her predatory schemes. If successful, it would demonstrate to everyone in the neighborhood exactly what was at stake and force Stella to reveal her true intentions. If it failed, I'd probably end up in jail and lose everything I'd worked for. The key to the plan was timing. Stella had scheduled a big community event for the following Saturday, a Lakeside Meadows development showcase where she planned to unveil her resort development plans to the entire neighborhood. She'd invited local politicians, media representatives, and potential investors to attend. It was supposed to be her moment of triumph, the event that would finally convince everyone that her vision for the neighborhood was the right one. But what Stella didn't know was that I'd been monitoring her communications with Pinnacle Resort Development. Through a combination of public records requests and some creative detective work, I'd discovered that the development company had already drawn up detailed plans for the resort, including the demolition of several existing homes and the construction of a hotel complex right where my cabin currently stood. I'd also learned that Stella had been embezzling money from the HOA treasury to pay for her legal fees and private investigators. She'd been using her position as president to write checks to herself and her associates, then hiding the expenditures in the HOA budget under vague categories like community improvement and legal expenses. It was fraud, plain and simple, but proving it would require access to financial records that were locked away in Stella's office. On Friday night, Victor and I met at my cabin to go over the final details of our plan. The security guards that Stella had hired were making regular patrols around the neighborhood, but they seemed more interested in harassing residents than actually providing security. We timed their routes and identified a window of opportunity when we could work without being observed. "Are you sure about this, Marcus?" Victor asked as we loaded equipment into his truck. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Stella's going to know it was us, and she's going to come after us with everything she's got." I looked out at the lake, where the community dock was illuminated by security lights. Tomorrow, that dock would be the center of attention for Stella's big event, but tonight, it was going to become the key to exposing her entire scheme. "Victor," I said, "I've been thinking about this for weeks. Stella Hayes moved into our neighborhood with a plan to steal our homes and destroy our community. She's used fraud, intimidation, and harassment to try to force us out. The legal system isn't going to protect us. We have to protect ourselves." I picked up one of the hydraulic pumps and loaded it into the truck. Besides, everything we're doing is on my property. If anyone's going to get in trouble, it should be me. At 11 o'clock that night, we launched Victor's boat from a private dock on the other side of the lake. The moon was dark and the water was calm, perfect conditions for what we needed to do. We'd practiced this operation several times over the past week, working out the timing and logistics until we could execute it smoothly and quickly. We weren't just setting up cables and pumps, we were preparing for a showdown. Every bolt I tightened felt like loading a bullet into a chamber. If this went wrong, I wouldn't just lose a dock, I could lose everything. Using underwater cables and a system of pulleys, we connected the dock's support structure to a series of hydraulic pumps hidden beneath the water's surface. The pumps were controlled by a remote device that I could operate from anywhere within a half-mile radius. The second step was to install underwater cameras that would document everything that happened. I wanted to make sure that when the dock disappeared, there would be video evidence of exactly how it happened and who was responsible. More importantly, I wanted to be able to prove that no one was harmed and that the dock could be restored to its original position at any time. The final step was to set up a backup power system that would keep the hydraulic pumps running even if someone tried to cut the power. We installed solar panels on the lake bottom and connected them to a battery system that could operate the pumps for several days without external power. By 4 in the morning, everything was in place. The dock looked exactly the same as it always had, but now it was sitting on a platform that could be raised or lowered at will. To anyone walking on the dock, it would feel solid and stable, but with the push of a button, the entire structure could disappear beneath the surface of the lake. As we loaded our equipment back into the truck, Victor turned to me with a grin. "You know what, Marcus? Win or lose, this is going to be one hell of a show." I couldn't help but smile back. After weeks of feeling powerless against Stella's legal and financial advantages, it felt good to finally have a plan that could level the playing field. "Victor," I said, "tomorrow is going to be a day that nobody in this neighborhood ever forgets. And when it's over, everyone's going to know exactly what kind of person Stella Hayes really is." As we drove back to my cabin, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. In less than 12 hours, Stella Hayes would be hosting her big event, expecting to celebrate her victory over the neighborhood. Instead, she was about to get the surprise of her life. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. Perfect weather for Stella's big development showcase. By 9 o'clock, cars were already arriving at the community center, and I could see workers setting up tables and displays near the lake. Stella had spared no expense for this event. There were catered refreshments, professional signage, and even a small stage where she planned to make her presentation. I watched from my cabin window as more people arrived. There were residents from the neighborhood, but also strangers in expensive suits, who I assumed were investors and development partners. I recognized a few faces from the local newspaper and what looked like a crew from the regional television station. Stella had clearly invited media coverage to document her triumph. At 10:30, I received a text message from Victor. Security guards just left for their coffee break. We're all set. I picked up the remote-controlled device and walked out onto my porch. From there, I had a clear view of the community dock, where several people were already gathering to listen to Stella's presentation. Stella Hayes was wearing a bright red dress and looked more confident than I'd ever seen her. She was standing on the dock, microphone in hand, addressing the crowd that had gathered around her. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice carried across the water, "thank you all for joining us today for this historic announcement. Today marks the beginning of a new chapter for Lakeside Meadows, one that will bring prosperity and growth to our entire community." I could see the local television crew setting up their camera equipment, and the newspaper photographer was taking pictures of Stella against the backdrop of the lake. This was exactly what she'd wanted: media attention, public recognition, and the chance to present herself as a visionary leader bringing progress to a backward community. "For too long," Stella continued, "this neighborhood has been held back by outdated thinking and resistance to change. But today I'm proud to announce that Pinnacle Resort Development has agreed to partner with us in creating a world-class resort destination right here on Mirror Lake." The crowd murmured with excitement, and I could see several residents nodding their approval. That's when I pressed the button. The surface of the lake was still, until it wasn't. Ripples spread like whispers. People frowned, glancing around. Then someone gasped. The dock was sinking, inch by inch, as if the lake itself had chosen rebellion. The dock was moving. Not swaying or shifting like it might in rough water, but actually sinking beneath the surface of the lake. "As you can see," Stella was saying, "our beautiful community dock will be the centerpiece of the resort's marina facility." But even as she spoke, the dock was disappearing beneath her feet. The water was rising over the wooden planks, and people were starting to step back toward the shore. Within minutes, the entire dock had vanished beneath the surface of the lake. Stella found herself standing waist-deep in water, still holding her microphone, with a look of absolute shock on her face. The crowd on the shore was pointing and shouting, and the television camera was capturing every moment of her humiliation. "What's happening?" someone yelled from the crowd. "Where did the dock go?" Stella tried to wade toward shore, but her red dress was weighing her down, and her high heels were stuck in the mud at the bottom of the lake. The microphone was still working, broadcasting her confused stammering to everyone present. That's when I made my entrance. I walked down from my cabin, carrying a folder full of documents, and approached the crowd that had gathered at the water's edge. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, "I think I can explain what just happened here." The television crew immediately turned their camera toward me, and the newspaper photographer started snapping pictures. I could see Stella struggling to get out of the water, her makeup running and her hair plastered to her head. But I kept my focus on the crowd, knowing that this was my one chance to tell my side of the story. "My name is Marcus Bennett," I said, "and I'm the legal owner of the lake bottom where that dock was sitting. According to these property records, which date back to 1972, my grandfather purchased not just the land where my cabin sits, but also the underwater rights to this entire section of the lake. I held up the documents for the camera to see. What you just witnessed was a demonstration of those property rights. The dock didn't disappear, it was lowered beneath the surface using hydraulic equipment that I installed on my own property, and it can be raised again just as easily. The crowd was buzzing with questions and confusion. Stella had finally made it to shore and was standing there, dripping wet, looking like a drowned rat. Her lawyers and development partners were huddled together, frantically making phone calls and reviewing documents. But more importantly, I continued, this demonstration proves that Stella Hayes has been misleading all of you about her development plans. She's been telling you that she can build a resort on this lake, but she never bothered to check who actually owns the lake bottom. She's been collecting your HOA fees and fining your properties based on fraudulent claims about community ownership. I pulled out Kyle Fisher's contract with Lakeside Development Partners and held it up for everyone to see. Stella Hayes isn't trying to improve our neighborhood, she's trying to steal it. She's been using the HOA as a front to pressure residents into selling their properties so she can turn our entire community over to resort developers. That moment, Stella finally found her voice. "This is sabotage," she screamed. "Marcus Bennett is a dangerous criminal who's been threatening our community and destroying our property." But her words carried no weight anymore. Standing there in her soaked red dress, with mud on her shoes and mascara running down her face, she looked less like a powerful HOA president and more like a con artist whose scheme had just been exposed. "Actually," I replied calmly, "I'm just a property owner exercising his legal rights. And speaking of legal rights, I think everyone here should know that Stella Hayes has been embezzling money from the HOA treasury to pay for her legal fees and private investigators." I pulled out the financial documents I'd obtained through public records requests. According to these HOA financial statements, Stella has written checks to herself totaling over $20,000 in the past 6 months, all disguised as community improvement expenses. That's fraud, and it's a felony. The crowd erupted in angry voices. Residents who had been supporting Stella's development plans were now demanding answers about the missing money. The media representatives were asking questions about the embezzlement allegations. And Stella's lawyers were trying to hustle her away from the scene before she said something that would make the situation even worse. But I wasn't finished yet. I pulled out the remote control device and pressed the button again. Slowly, the dock began to rise from beneath the surface of the lake. Within minutes, it was back to its original position, looking exactly as it had before the demonstration began. "As you can see," I announced, "the dock is perfectly fine. No damage has been done and normal community activities can resume immediately. The only thing that's changed is that everyone now knows the truth about Stella Hayes and her development scheme." As the crowd began to disperse, I could see that the tide had turned completely. Residents who had been supporting Stella were now questioning everything she'd told them. The media representatives were already preparing stories about the HOA fraud and the property rights dispute, and Stella herself was being escorted away by her lawyers, no doubt planning her next move in what had become a very public battle. But I knew this wasn't over. Stella Hayes might have been humiliated today, but she still had resources, connections, and a strong motivation to fight back. The real battle was just beginning. The aftermath of the dock demonstration was swift and decisive. By Monday morning, the local newspaper had published a front-page story about the HOA fraud and property rights dispute, complete with photographs of Stella Hayes standing waist-deep in lake water. The regional television station had aired a segment about the disappearing dock drama, and the story was already spreading on social media. More importantly, Deputy Harris called me on Sunday evening to inform me that the county sheriff's office was opening an official investigation into the HOA's financial practices. "Marcus," he said, "those documents you provided about the embezzlement are solid evidence. We're going to need you to come in and make a formal statement, but it looks like Miss Hayes is in serious legal trouble." By Tuesday, Stella had lawyered up and vanished from sight. No press statements, no denials, just silence. But silence speaks volumes, and when the subpoenaed records hit the county office, they sang like a choir of betrayal, but the damage had already been done. Once the financial records were subpoenaed, it became clear that the embezzlement was even more extensive than I'd initially discovered. Stella had been siphoning money from the HOA treasury for months, using the funds to pay for her legal battle against me and her secret negotiations with Pinnacle Resort Development. The HOA members called an emergency meeting for Wednesday evening to address the crisis. This time, the community center was packed with angry residents demanding answers. Stella didn't show up. Her lawyers had advised her to avoid any public appearances until the criminal investigation was resolved, but her absence only made things worse, as residents interpreted it as an admission of guilt. Kyle Fisher stood up during the meeting and publicly apologized for his role in Stella's scheme. "I want everyone to know that I was offered money to support the development project," he said. "I was told it would increase all our property values and bring jobs to the community. But after seeing what really happened, I realized I was being used as part of a con game." Mia Liu took the microphone next and provided a detailed account of the harassment she'd experienced from Stella's administration. "She was trying to force me out of my home," Mia explained. "The constant fines, the utility shutoffs, the legal threats, it was all designed to make my life so miserable that I'd give up and sell to her development partners." The most damaging testimony came from Victor Gray, who revealed that Stella had tried to bribe him to sabotage my property. "She offered me $10,000 to cut Marcus's water lines and damage his cabin's foundation," Victor told the shocked crowd. "She said it would look like normal maintenance problems, but it would give her grounds to condemn the property as uninhabitable." By Thursday, the county district attorney had filed formal charges against Stella Hayes for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The charges carried potential prison sentences totaling up to 15 years. Pinnacle Resort Development immediately distanced themselves from the project, claiming they had been deceived about the community's support for development. On Friday, I received a call from Stella's attorney asking if I would be willing to meet with his client to discuss a settlement. "Ms. Hayes is prepared to make a full confession and provide restitution to the HOA," he explained. "In exchange, she's hoping you might consider dropping the civil lawsuits and supporting a plea agreement that would allow her to avoid prison time." I agreed to the meeting, but only on the condition that it be held in public, with other community members present. We met at the community center on Saturday morning, with Victor Gray, Mia Liu, Kyle Fisher, and several other residents in attendance. Deputy Harris was there as well, representing the county sheriff's office. Stella Hayes looked like a completely different person from the confident woman who had confronted me at my fence just a few weeks earlier. She was wearing a simple gray dress, her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hands were shaking as she read from a prepared statement. "I want to apologize to everyone in this community for what I've done," she began. "I came here with a plan to make money from real estate development, and I was willing to lie, cheat, and steal to make that plan work. I formed the HOA under false pretenses, I embezzled money from the community treasury, and I used harassment and intimidation to try to force people out of their homes." She looked directly at me as she continued. "Marcus Bennett was right to fight back against what I was doing. Everything he said about my scheme was true. I was planning to sell this entire neighborhood to resort developers, and I was going to use the HOA as a weapon to force anyone who opposed me to give up their properties." The room was completely silent as Stella concluded her statement. "I'm prepared to make full restitution for all the money I stole, and I'm willing to dissolve the HOA and return control of the community to the residents. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I hope this is a start toward making things right." After the meeting, I walked back to my cabin feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the whole situation could have been avoided if Stella had simply been honest about her intentions from the beginning. The community had been torn apart by her schemes, and it would take time to rebuild the trust and cooperation that had been damaged. But there were positive signs as well. The HOA was officially dissolved, and residents were already talking about forming a new community organization based on transparency and genuine democratic participation. Kyle Fisher had volunteered to serve as interim treasurer, with full financial oversight from the community. Mia Liu was organizing a neighborhood watch program to prevent future scams and fraud. As for me, I finally had my peaceful lakeside life back. The fence around my property was removed, my utilities were restored, and I could once again enjoy my morning coffee on the dock without worrying about legal threats or harassment. The community dock was back in operation, and kids were once again taking swimming lessons and fishing from the end of the pier. 3 months later, I received a letter from a neighborhood association in another state. They were dealing with a similar situation, a newly formed HOA that was imposing excessive fines and threatening property seizures. They'd heard about my battle with Stella Hayes and wanted to know if I could provide advice on how to fight back against HOA corruption. I wrote back with a detailed explanation of the legal research I'd done, the documentation I'd gathered, and the strategy I'd used to expose Stella's scheme. But I also included a warning. Fighting corrupt HOAs requires patience, courage, and a willingness to take risks. It's not a battle that everyone can win, and it's not a battle that should be fought lightly. But sometimes, when your home and your community are under attack, fighting back is the only option you have. And sometimes, if you're smart enough, brave enough, and lucky enough, you can make the bad guys disappear just as easily as you can make a dock vanish beneath the surface of a lake. The truth is, bullies like Stella Hayes count on people being too intimidated, too isolated, or too overwhelmed to fight back. They use legal jargon, financial pressure, and social manipulation to make their victims feel powerless. But when communities come together, when neighbors support each other, and when people are willing to stand up for what's right, even the most sophisticated con artists can be defeated. As I sit here on my dock, watching the sunset over Mirror Lake, I'm reminded that home isn't just about property rights or legal documents. It's about community, about belonging, and about having a place where you can be yourself without fear of harassment or intimidation. Stella Hayes tried to take that away from all of us, but in the end, she only succeeded in bringing us closer together. And that's a victory worth fighting for.